inveterate producer here. And Jim, a very, very special welcome to you on this return visit after having been with the Village a couple of years ago to talk about your book, Presidential Misconduct. James Banner is an extraordinary historian. I think he knows history in all its facets, whether it's ancient Greece or the American Revolution to the contemporary scene. He's been a teacher. He writes articles and books. He cares about education and public affairs. What is the role of historian? That's something too, I think maybe we can hear more about today. He's founded associations, he served on boards, he's been a recipient of fellowships, he's even served in the US Army. Thank you for that service. And currently he is a budding playwright. But in the last few months, we have seen Jim's come out with a new book. And Jim, of course, we have to ask, why did you write this book?
Am I muted? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can, good. Thank you, Lorna, for the nice introduction. I think it's, in this case, knowing how the book came about is very important to your understanding my own efforts to write it. And this is something that can happen any place in the world, but it usually only happens specifically in Washington, D.C. Some years ago, I found myself on a weekday morning sitting with a colleague in the chambers of Justice Clarence Thomas. He's a very lively, very sunny, very intelligent man who's just jurisprudence is not mine, but we were having a terrific discussion. He realized he had a couple of historians there, and he said to us, "Hey, you guys, very informal man, you guys would certainly like to know that I'm spending the summer reading the history of slavery in the South." So what were we going to say? He said, "Terrific, Mr. Justice, what are you reading?" We were having an adult conversation. And he listed the books, he listed this, that, and the other thing, but he said, "I'm not reading the revisionists." Well, every single book he was reading was a book that any knowledgeable historian would call a revisionist history, because it was part of a new literature on slavery in the South that broke sharply with what was then sort of the orthodoxy about those two subjects that had come into being in the 1920s and 30s. And so that conversation lingered with me. And because historians like myself, we talk about revisionist history all the time, and we know that our historians differ from each other. They argue with each other. Sometimes they viciously attack each other for being wrong or going at things badly. And after all, some are Christians, some are Jews, some are Muslims, some are Latin Americans, some are Gambians, some are Chinese. We come at the same subject for all sorts of reasons and differ because of that. Justice Thomas, who should have known better, didn't. So I decided, when other things fell away from my desk, that I'd try my hand at it. It turns out there was a book before on the subject 92 years ago. To my knowledge, mine is only the second book on the subject in the English language. So the other book was really quite good, but it didn't speak to our time, which of course is one of the things we might want to talk about this afternoon. So I decided to try my hand at it. I made up the subject as I went along. If any of you tried to write a book on the subject, it would come out differently. I'm confident of that, and I would welcome that. I'm still learning about it and would like people to tell me where I left things out or where I went wrong and so on, because there are not many guideposts. But that, in short, is how the book that came out last March or April came to be.
Well, I'm sure Justice Thomas would be pleased to know that he inspired such an interesting book.
Well, I sent him a copy.
Oh.
And I got a nice response early in the summer saying, "Thanks so much. I don't recall the conversation, but thanks so much. I look forward to reading the book this summer." Well, it's now fall. I haven't heard from him. Maybe never will, but I'd be interested if he responds what he says to me.
Well, be on the lookout. So when you're saying the word, the term revisionist history, what does it engender? What does that mean?
That's the central question. And I give what some of my colleagues think is too sort of promiscuous, a too general definition, but it's purposeful, and I do hold to it. I look at revisionist history as encompassing virtually all history that's written. It's a challenge to, an addition to, an alteration in any existing history of any subject because of additions to evidence, new methods of interpreting the past, new perspectives on the past, and of course, differences among human beings, their cultures, their societies, their ages, their sexes, their races, their languages, and so on. So every written history differs from every other one, in my view. Now, it's a matter of scale. We can talk about that a little later. There are major revisions of the historical past, at least interpretation of them. And then there are major changes in the way a Civil War battle is portrayed. Obviously, the first one is far more important than the last one, but there are changes and arguments and additions to all kinds of subjects at all scale of inquiry. So that's the way I think it's best to look at any work of history that you read, that you hold in your lap and go through and learn from. It's only one way of looking at the subject. It was written by a particular person at a particular time from a different place in a different culture, in a specific culture. That's what you're getting. You're not getting the final word on the subject.
Well, I'm curious then, Jim, because when you say written history, I'm thinking today of how many people liked oral history, the traditions that are handed down orally that may not wind up written. For example, I'm thinking of slave narratives in the 19th century. There are some, but how many stories do we not have? And how do you incorporate that into a notion of what constitutes history?
Well, I'd love to be asked back to talk just about that because I'm working on something that has to tussle with the question of silences. What isn't there? What has been forced out by whites not paying any attention to their slaves? All of that kind of stuff. It's a very, very complicated theoretical and a problem and one of practice. But let me answer that. Oral history, in some respects, Lorna, is the very first method that was used. Herodotus of Halicarnassus walked around the Near East and the Greek and the Persian and Egyptian territories, asking people about their past and their present, and he wrote it down. Now, I mean, he interviewed people. He was our first oral historian, the father of history was our very first oral historian. So there are many means, there are many formats, there are many media, we would say today, in which information is captured, and it's from information that knowledge and interpretation come. So it's with the introduction of new media, new methods of proceeding. For example, computers have enabled us to analyze existing census data. We couldn't have done it before. I mean, there just wasn't time in the world with hundreds of people working on the same stuff. Now it can all be digitized and run through machines, and we can ask questions of it and get it right away. We couldn't have, we were wise enough not to try to ask those questions formally and in practice before, because we couldn't have answered them. Now we can ask the questions and we can answer them. That's because there are new means available for us to draw answers from.
So it sounds as if being a historian is full-time employment. There's always going to be something to learn.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's always need for people like ourselves. And actually, unlike a lot of people who work in this world, we really enjoy it. We have fun. We get paid for having fun.
So it's interesting when you say you talk about, the academic world, the historians, and then there are people like a lot of us, we're the general public who consume books and knowledge. So why is this something we as the public should care about? And I imagine that as you were writing this book, because you mentioned earlier, there really wasn't a roadmap, and there was, because the other book was, almost 100 years ago. So what have you been able to draw any conclusions from this whole process?
Yes, they're my conclusions. And I want, again, I really want to make clear to all of you that I consider historical knowledge and historical interpretations and what I'm saying today to be partial and provisional. I mean, I hope that you will, if not agree with me, you'll listen to me and at least think what I'm saying has some authority and is interesting to you, and you can carry it away from our discussion. But these are, Lorna asked the right question. What have I taken away from writing the book? Let me go through a few conclusions that I've come to and convictions of mine that were created in writing the book and have been strengthened every day since. First of all, revisionist history. The changes by one historian of what a previous historian has said start with Herodotus and Thucydides 2,500 years ago. They don't originate in the 1960s. They don't originate with the New Left. They don't originate with today's right or with CNN or with Fox News. Debates over what happened in the past and how you interpret it are as old as historical inquiry. Herodotus is considered to be the first person to write extended interpretive history, to go into historical inquiry. His near contemporary, older than Herodotus, their lives overlapped a little bit. Herodotus, in effect, said of Herodotus's work, play. It's a ridiculous way to do things. It doesn't work, and I'm not going to write the history of the wars, of Peloponnesian Wars, the way Herodotus wrote the history of the Persian Wars. So right there at the beginning, a debate was joined over what is the correct and the meat and the fit and the right way to do history. And Thucydides walked off with the award for about 2,300 years, because Herodotus was an omnivorous, curious historian, oral interviewer, ethnographer, geographer. He was remarkably curious, and in order to explain the victory of the Greeks over those he called the barbarians, really the Persians, he took in everything, dress codes, singing, marching formations, kingly investitures, all these kinds of things. And Thucydides said, that's ridiculous. You don't explain things that way. And anyway, the correct subject of history in order for history to teach lessons is warfare, statecraft, politics, and of course, men. And so for 2,300 years, you and I were taught, mostly by men, but even when women taught, and starting in good numbers in the 20th century, they taught the same subjects. And it was all political history. You and I were raised on political history. And when the right wing today complains about the decline in the teaching of political history, what they're really doing is complaining about the decline in Thucydides' approach to the past, because social and cultural and intellectual history have now taken a place on the syllabi of all of our courses. And in order to do so, the amount of attention given to diplomacy and politics and political parties and warfare has had to decline. QED, I mean, there was no other way to do it. So, but we've been in this tension, which is really a philosophical difference of why you teach history and what's the good of learning about the past. Thucydides thought you learn the past to learn lessons that will instruct you as you live your life. That thought never crossed Herodotus's mind. His intention was entirely different. He was trying to explain why the Greeks won a war. He wanted to save the past to edify the present but not to teach it. And so we've been wrestling with that. So this is something old as historical inquiry in the Western world, which is the only thing I'm dealing with. And also, I think it's clear that it's inherent in the way historians go about their work. You can't get rid of interpretation. You can't get rid of differences. You can't get rid of argument. You can't get rid of your need and historians' more professional need to create meaning from the past, the same way we do in our lives from the present. Another thing I've come to understand is that no one wins historical battles. If the left wins it today, the right will win it tomorrow. If the right wins it today, the left will win it tomorrow. I mean, take an example from the lifetime that some of us remember. The battle over espionage, about the Rosenbergs, about Alger Hiss in the 40s and 50s. It was thought through the 70s, at least, that Alger Hiss was innocent, that the Rosenbergs had been framed, and that terrible injustice had been done to those three and related figures. Now, given evidence that had been unearthed in the open Soviet archives and so on, it's really quite clear that Hiss and the Rosenbergs and David Greenglass and others were espionage. We're making it easier for the Soviet Union to function during the Second World War and the Cold War than we had thought before. So in a sense, at the moment, most historians, despite the pain it causes some of them, have to admit on the grounds of evidence that Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs were guilty. Now, that doesn't mean we won't discover some things in another 50 years to throw doubt on what is now currently the kind of consensus view. But in that sense, the left had the victory in its hands some years ago, some decades ago. Now the right has the victory in its hands on that issue. That's the way it always is. So there are no permanent victories in the arguments among historians, what I call the battles of over the past. Another thing I think is clear, and that is there are many varieties of revisionist history and many sources of it. The top, I would put at the peak, what I call transformational history. And in the Western world, it's really only happened, in my view, twice. Remember, until the early part of the 4th century AD, all history was written from a pagan standpoint. It was secular, it was pagan. It came out of the Greek and Roman worlds. Oh yes, there were gods there, but there wasn't the single God, the Trinity. There was the Jewish God, but that hadn't broken out to have kind of universal import as the Greek and Roman conception of the past maintained in the Western world until the advent of Christianity, and eventually Constantine's declaration that Christianity would be the religion of the Roman Empire. Well, that required a historical explanation going back to the beginning, going back to the Garden of Eden, as to how human life came about and how you explained it. That fell to a bishop in Caesarea on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean in what we now call Palestine, today's Israel. This was Eusebius. You may not have heard much of Eusebius, but Eusebius created the first Christian historiography. It's very critical. He used documents. It's really quite remarkable work. And it appeared at about I guess, the year 330, 340. And we have been under its yoke ever since. Now, to be sure, there have been secular attacks on it, and starting with the Renaissance, there was an erosion of the Christian settlement of historiography, and people began questioning whether we needed to have gods in the picture and so on. And of course, we face today a much more secular view of the past and an approach to it. But we still think of the past when we think of the Christian calendar and everything else in Christian terms. And there's never been a transformation from one era to another as abrupt and as pervasive as that. Now, the second candidate in my canon, and I'm certain people will attack me for it, and maybe you think I'm nuts, is the Marxian revolution of the 19th century. Now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came second, so they never were able to vanquish the Christian worldview of the present or the past. They've cut into it, they've challenged it, they've certainly created different politics than we've had before. But those two, it seems to me, are transformational ways of looking at the past as well as the present. Then there's something a little bit subsidiary, what I would call philosophical differences. Those are the differences that I mentioned before between Herodotus and Thucydides. Then there are conceptual revisions. As an example, I would cite the feminist transformation of history in the last 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, it has really transformed the way that we think about the past, because we understand much more about women's place in the past, even if it wasn't in the presidential mansion or in most of the royal houses. In other words, we understand now what it meant for women to participate in the household and in the fields and in village economies and so on. So women's participation in the rendering and the interpreting the past is now permeating. And that's a deep conceptual change. And then there's normal historiography, as I call it, what I do all the time. I argue with my colleagues. I write a review and I say, no, she doesn't have that quite right. Or I write an article and I put something in the footnote and say, Professor Smith didn't do a very good job there. He overlooked something. I mean, we're always arguing with each other and trying to, and that means that we're adjusting our understanding of specific events, specific developments, and so on. That's the normal fare of all of us. So we're always involved in that kind of historical argument. And finally, and this is really, I think, the most for me, it was surprising how much writing this book confirmed inchoate views about what I've done all my life. And that is that there's a gap that is unclosable between what happened in the past and what we think happened. What happened was what happened. What we write about is what is recorded or written about what happened. And even the video recording of some events in Charlottesville, Virginia, for example, a few years ago, it comes from the left or the right. Some cameras are above, some are underfoot, some are wielded by the policeman, some by amateurs. Some are down the street, some are close up. That gives you a picture of the picture of what happened, but it doesn't give you everything. So what am I interpreting that set of events? What am I to rely on? Am I to think that everything that was captured on film that day is the entirety of the picture and our understanding of what actually happened? I can't do that anymore. So I've given up the thought of writing objective history. I do not believe that any of the history that I have written, this book included, that my colleagues have written, that Thucydides and Herodotus and Eusebius and Gibbon and Ronca and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they weren't writing objective history. And there's no way that we will ever get to objective history. We're closing in always asymptotically, the way lines do going out deep into the universe, always getting closer together, but they'll never touch between what happened and what we think would happen. So I look upon everything that I've done, everything I know about the past, and I urge you to do so as you hold in your hand a book of history and read it. That what you're reading is one way to look at one subject written by one person from a particular culture of a particular sex and so forth and so on. It's provisional. It's not going to, that interpretation is not going to be permanently triumphant in interpreting the subject that you're reading about. There is no end point to our interpretation or understanding of the past. That's what I accept to be the case. That makes me, you probably heard the term, that makes me, I didn't mean to become one. I'm sort of a little nervous about defining myself, but that makes me a postmodernist. Namely, I don't think there is any firm standpoint to look at the past or even the present. It's my standpoint, yours is your standpoint. They're both possibly, prospectively, equally valid if they can be supported by at least some evidence, but they're not the final word. As it is of the present, so it is of the past. That's what I've taken away from the book I wrote.
That's a lot. And I find your last observation to be particularly fascinating. I actually had a neighbor who was in her 90s, and she decided to read 2 versions of the Bible simultaneously so that she was able to see how the translations differed. And I thought, she did this 30 years ago, but she was just, a curious woman. But for those
that raises a very interesting question. I mean, you read one book, let's say you read Proust translated by 2 different people into English. Well, there are those, the Moncrief one and the newer one, and I'm told that they differ quite substantially. Well, they're translations, people can argue as to which is the best one, but each one conveys its own particular weight, its own particular meaning with very specific sentences and paragraphs and so on. I don't see how you can get away with that when you're dealing with 2 translators coming to the same French words that Proust wrote and coming out with different translations. I mean, that's a nice analog, Lorna, because it's what we face when we're looking at the past as well.
But I'm also remembering I had the luxury of working next door to the National Archives, and they bring in authors. And I think it was Hedrick Smith who had just written a biography of Henry Kissinger. And he found, I think it was Rick Smith, but in any event, what stuck with me about his writing of the book is that he discovered that Kissinger kept multiple memos of the same incident. One was for his file, one was for the State Department file, different offices. I think the author said there were 5 or 6 different versions of the same event. So how do you know what's right, what's accurate, and is truth really, what is the truth?
Well, I know one thing from that, Lorna, and that is that I feel myself now a very wise man for never paying much attention to what Henry Kissinger writes. I had better reason than I knew. Well, that's exactly the case, and that's why historians have to take evidence from many sources and triangulate them and try to figure out. See, again, I want to use metaphor sort of approaching what happened, approaching the truth, or approaching a generally acceptable understanding of professionals who look at the past as to what really happened. But we always have to maintain doubt in the first place, and also a recognition that we probably have never, we still haven't gotten to the full story. We just keep doing the best we can. And I think if all of you were to take your favorite subject and read 3 different books about it, say the French Revolution, I'm gonna take a big topic, take a small one, it's your choice. You'd see that each one gives you new perspectives on the same set of events, and all of them probably have some validity, and they may be quite altogether different, all 3 of them. And yet they're perfectly, in some respects, they offer an aperture into what happened, and they should be trusted up to a certain point as having provided you with 3 fresh and different interpretations of the same phenomenon.
But I'm sure you and many others may be aware of Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin in the early 1850s. and the furor it created, that people said, how can this be true? This is too hard. This can't be true. And then she writes what she called the key, where she justifies, she cites the sources, whether it's Frederick Douglass or something she actually observed. And I found that fascinating. Is that something that would be helpful today? Can you think of any other author who might do something like that?
Oh, yes, of course. He's a neighbor of ours. His name is Bob Woodward.
Oh,
But he doesn't attribute anything. How many files does he have? We can't check up on Woodward. And we couldn't check up on Harriet Beecher Stowe. She made claims for the grounding of her novel, which of course was fiction anyway. And fiction has to pass the test of plausibility, and hers certainly did. It fits with what we know otherwise about slavery and the slave trade and so on. There's no way for me to tell, for you to tell, for any of us to tell whether Bob Woodward accurately transcribes, or his helpers accurately transcribe his tapes, whether he's quoting from them accurately. There's no way, but we don't know who he interviewed, so we can't go to Joe Schmo and say, hey, Joe, did you really say this to Bob? You can't. So, I mean, it's very hard for us as historians to use that stuff, and it has to be used with great caution. And every place in the footnote or every sentence that you're quoting Bob Woodward, you have to say, as Bob Woodward says, without the production of any evidence.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. It seems as if maybe I'm just noticing it of late because I've been reading more histories and biographies, that the number of footnotes and the references take up a third of the book. I mean, is that a trend? Do you see? Is that helpful in?
Well, it depends upon the author and the publisher. I mean, scholars, particularly in their monographic books, their very detailed books, do pile the footnotes in. Some histories that are designed for more popular reading now, there's shortened footnotes that go at the back. I mean, when I have footnotes and things I write, I insist they go on the bottom of the page, otherwise the publisher won't get them, because I think they should run along with the text. This book, The Ever-Changing Past, doesn't have any footnotes. It just has notes at the end of each chapter for further reading. Because and Yale University Press, which is a very demanding publishing house, said that was fine with them because they trusted me. And they, trust and other people read and checked up on the quotations and so on, as I did. There are all sorts of ways of doing this, and some people find footnotes to be very off-putting. That's why they often go in the back. That's fine with me. I like to read books that have them right in front of my nose at the bottom of the page.
Let me, if I may, just ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up to the folks who are with us today. How does changing our view of the past affect the present and the future?
That is something probably for philosophers and theologians, but let me tell you how I look at that, because it is a profoundly important question. I look at, I'm speaking now for myself, but I think it's probably the case for all of us. I look at my historical knowledge as part of the way in which I calibrate my balance in the world. It's sort of a gyroscope. It orients me. I mean, I'm probably mixing metaphors terribly here. It keeps my balance as I look at the horizon and as I look back in my life and try to make sense of it. And as I learn more, it gives me a greater ability to understand not only what has happened, but what is possible that can happen in human existence. I'm not of the crowd that thinks that historical knowledge is directly useful. I mean, sometimes it is. If you and I are arguing about a subject and you can point to the evidence that I'm wrong, that's fine, that's useful in that sense. But I'm not certain that history teaches us something. It teaches us what can happen, But history's strength is in particulars, not in generalizations. Arnold Toynbee may be read, he was read a lot, but historians don't pay him much heed because we don't think there's much confidence to be placed in vast generalizations about the laws of history. But we think in understanding the particularities, we can understand how people act under stress. Certainly the military learns a lot from studying previous battles and campaigns about what went right and what went wrong and what perhaps can be duplicated and what weapons can be developed in order to avoid the troubles that happened. Sure, we learn in that sense. But it may be that you and I can learn from history, but boy, oh boy, I sure don't when I look at my fellow humans. I think I have to conclude that I'm part of them, we don't.
Okay, well, so much to think about and talk about. Jonas, would you like to?
Sure. Well, I think it's going. Thank you very much for. I don't know. I'm thoroughly entertained by the whole thing so far. So thank you very much. There was a question that came in through the chat, but I want to reiterate to everyone on. There's a couple of different ways to do it. You're welcome to type a question to the chat that I will read off shortly. You're also welcome to raise your hand and I'll call on you, or just unmute yourself and I'll try to catch you're unmuted and then call on you as well. But there was a question that came in through the chat that I thought was fairly interesting, saying you talk of two big shifts in history, and then they asked, what about the rediscovery of ancient learning through Islamic libraries and things like that?
Of course. I mean, I should have said, I think I dropped it into my words too quickly at the outset of my comments. I've been dealing with the history in the Western world only. Now, of course, Western knowledge owns a great deal to certainly Egyptian, that's pre-Islamic knowledge. And increasingly, as the Islamic world spread, it has gathered knowledge from the Islamic world. And there's been a back and forth now in this global situation that we find ourselves in among all civilizations and cultures. I did not mean to omit recognition of that fact earlier. I can't speak as a historian to any of those subjects because I'm simply just not well enough versed in them. I was talking principally about the Western world. Now, the same situation does exist in the Islamic world and in the Chinese world and so on. I just can't speak to those issues.
I think Burke wanted to follow up on our question there, which you're welcome to do, Burke, if you want to mute yourself. You're going to be muted though, Burke, so.
Yeah, that was my question. That wasn't exactly my question. The period, what I was asking about is when the West rediscovered Western history through Islamic libraries, not what it learned about Islam, but what it learned about history through the Islamic, how we kind of lost our history and rediscovered it. I was interested in your comments on that.
Well, is it true that we lost it and rediscovered it, or is it that we didn't know it existed and we found it and we were enlightened by it? I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind, this has to do with the way in which history changes as new evidence comes to light. We take the example of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, it's absolutely transformed our understanding of Jewish culture and civilization. So in that sense, sure, the West has gained from Islamic cultures, and no doubt there's stuff lying around in Chinese, Japanese libraries that will tell us things about Western history that the Japanese and the Chinese and others in the East knew before we knew it, or can tell us about ourselves because we haven't known about it, surely. And one of the wonderful things about history today, and by the growth in communications, is that the community of historians is now truly worldwide. It's universal, it's global, it's cosmopolitan. And aside from those few historians who, it appears all the time, always are muzzled, we do a pretty good job of, we have this grand confraternity of practitioners around the world now. We share our knowledge, we argue with each other, sometimes on nationalistic grounds, particularistic grounds, religious grounds, but we're all together now arguing, and it's very hard to keep things from each other. We don't even try, the responsible ones among us.
Great. Thank you very much for that question, Burke. Monica messaged me to say she would like to ask a question. If you unmute yourself, Monica, you're welcome to ask. But you are going to have to unmute yourself before you ask the question, Monica.
Donna has one there.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering, since as digital forms of communications have become prime in how we deal with all sorts of subjects from politics on down, and have replaced the traditional methodologies, which are based on the written forms of communication, whether in letters, essays, and etc. How is that going to affect the doing of history going forward?
Well, it's affected my doing history during the pandemic, for example, because rather than having to go to libraries, which I'm happy to do, I was able to pull up lots of stuff on the very screen that I'm seeing you on now. Now, I don't trust what I find on most sites in front of me. I either want to go to the originals or I want to go, say, to the copies that have been digitized by the National Archives. But it's made our work extraordinarily easier than it used to be when the evidence that we need and want has been digitized. A lot still has not been. And of course, there's a lot of fake stuff out there. So one has to guard against that. But there have always been fakes. One of the great triumphs of forensic history was achieved by Lorenzo Valla, the Florentine, early in the Renaissance, early in the, I think for him it was the 15th century. He was on the ground of his philological knowledge, he was able to show that the document that had been cited for centuries as extending authority from the Emperor Constantine to the Bishop of Rome to become the Pope of the Christian Church was a forgery. So right then, I mean, it was an incredibly important moment in the history of historical knowledge and historical practice, where someone brought a detective's mind and skill to bear on the authenticity of a document. And so we have to do that now, all of us have to be Lorenzo Vallas. We can use stuff. I turn to the screen all the time, and I'm willing to take the gross dates, the gross dates, the dates of birth and death of figures that are, but I still at some point check up on them. But if it's the 23rd rather than 24th of February, I'm gonna check in 2 or 3 places to see which one it really is. And I think all of us have to be somewhat cautious. And of course, sometimes the work we do is more important than some other work we do on screen. I mean, I can't, as a scholar, I cannot risk trusting everything I find on this computer. But some things I can, because they're of no moment to you or to me. They're just informal stuff I want to find out. It doesn't make too much difference whether it's completely accurate. It serves my purpose.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent question. I saw Alan, you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question, Alan?
Yes, I read a book this summer called The Daughter of Time, which is fairly on point with this discussion. Have you read the book ever?
I'm sorry, would you ask that again, Mr. Ingber?
I read a book called The Daughter of Time, where it's all revisionist about the Hunchback, the old king.
I haven't read that book.
Oh no, I think you'd find that very interesting. Richard III. It's all shows how Richard III is all false. Everything we know about him.
I see. Well, I'll make a note of it, and I'll take your recommendation seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard or Barry, did you have a question?
Yeah, journalists are always claiming that they are writing the first draft of history. Is that correct, or are their views so biased as to be unreliable? And part two, is there ever a correct interpretation of history, or are we just destined to end up with nothing?
Well, there are more than two questions there. I hope you understand, because one has to do, you didn't ask it, but it's embodied in your last question. It has to do with despair. I mean, if I thought that I was making no progress in understanding the past and helping you, someone interested in the topics I've written about, get a closer understanding of the past than you had before you read what I wrote, I would despair, because it would mean that all the work I've been done is for nothing. If I've been doing the work in the confidence that what I've written is always going to be the gospel truth about the subjects that I've written about, but that doesn't bring me to despair. But the answer to your question as to whether you can believe anything written about the past, that if I answer that, no, you can't, then all that I've devoted my life to is worthless. And so what I've done, like most of the things that all of us have done, is an act of faith in its if not if its authority, at least its authenticity as I see it. But only you and my fellow historians can judge as to whether I've succeeded. Now, journalists, well, what they mean by that is that, and it doesn't always happen, but it means that that crowd, those professionals, are the first on the scene. That's fine. But so are other people today. You know that. The journalists aren't around, but I'm there with my iPhone and I'm capturing the scene when the cop beats some poor bystander on the head with a baton. I mean, all sorts of people now are on the scene to be the first recorders of history. And we have to I think we have to, just to operate, we have to have some confidence. You have to have some confidence, I do too, in the veracity of what they write and their editors allowed to go on the pages of newspapers and before the cameras. We have to trust in their integrity, and then we have to check it all out. So I would say it's not only the first draft of history, it's one of many first drafts of history. And that's it. I have confidence in the stiffs who were reporting from the battle lines in Vietnam more than I have confidence in Bob Woodward. It's not that I think that Bob Woodward is unethical or that he's a liar, but it's just that you don't have any way to check up on what he has written. And so we all should be able to put the facts that are put before us to the test. And you can do that with journalists. Because look, the White House reporter for the Post may be in the same room, but sees different things going on than the White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So you read two papers or three, if you care about subjects that most, because the writers are going to come out the subjects differently, and their editors are going to allow different things onto the front pages. Did I wander too much, or does that get at what you were asking? They're all very important questions.
No, it just seems to me that if we read Fox News account of something and then compare it to that of the New York Times, I'm not sure we're going to find a lot of agreement. And how am I supposed to know what's correct?
Well, that's where your your being a thinking man comes in. I mean, first of all, you can say, I don't trust either of them, and I don't think that probably is very helpful. You can say to yourself, I know enough about this subject, whether it's about the past or the present, to know that this one's got it right and this one doesn't, or that both sort of have missed the point. You're certainly informed enough to know the difference between fact and opinion. I mean, there's a difference, and one can usually make that out, and then you have to compare, and you have to talk with other people, and so on. And this is another thing that we haven't talked about, and that is that I, like the owners and the on-camera people at Fox News and MSNBC and so on, I come to my life and your life and what I experience with my disposition, not yours. I see things the way I see it, not the way you see it. My ears are different than yours. My eyes are different than yours. My education, my origins are all different from yours. And at some point, they're necessarily going to differ. And you may not say that I'm ignorant and I won't charge you with blasphemy, but we'll disagree. I mean, there's no way, because we see things differently, and historians do too. It's one of the reasons why histories of the same subject differ, because different people and different kinds of people are writing those histories. And the same is the case with journalists, with reporters, and with, I mean, there are some people who report the solid fact, even on Fox News, I suppose.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any more questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat. We have a few minutes left here. I know Lorna has a point, but I want to make sure, see if there's anyone else from the group that has anything to say.
If I may, I know recently, one of the things that Jim and I were talking about is it's not just history that gets revised. Science, anthropology. We saw the recent article about the footsteps with the seeds, you know, changing our impression of early man. Vermeer, now that they have the new tools to look at the background, what they thought was something turned out to be a Cupid, totally changing our impression of Vermeer. And then today, just finding out that this wonderful Rubens painting has been determined to be a fake. So how the tools, and maybe that gets back to what Donna was saying about the digital stuff, how are the tools that are coming up, the changes in the ability to examine things, as you mentioned earlier too, Jim, the way the census, we can do that, and relying on artificial intelligence. I mean,
let me clear one thing up. Art doesn't change, history doesn't change, anthropology doesn't change, physics don't change. Our understanding of the past and of art and of music and of human psychology, and let me say, to drop this other matter that I haven't spoken about, our knowledge of memory from neuroscience has made it very clear to me, at least, that and we all perceive things in different ways, so we remember different things. You know, some of you certainly have sat in history or other classrooms in college and maybe later, and the lecturer is yakking at you, and suddenly someone bursts into the back of the room and throws something on the floor and curses and runs out. And of course, it's all staged. And the professor says, "What happened? Write it down." And of course, everybody has seen different things, different details, notices different things, interprets things differently. So that's what we face. And yes, our understanding of the Rubens and of the number of thousands of years that humans have lived on this continent and of Jewish history, because the Dead Sea Scrolls, look at what we've learned about Thomas Jefferson. We could not have demonstrated quite conclusively that he was the father of children by his enslaved concubine, Sally Hemings, until we had improvements in genetic science and the capacity to decode people's DNA. So sure, but the history of Jefferson, the reality about what Jefferson did and was, didn't change. Our ability, because of changes in technology, made us alter our view of the author of the Declaration of Independence. That's a different thing. History didn't change, but the depth of our knowledge of the past was increased.
I think that's an excellent example. Jefferson, I went to Monticello a few months ago. They've done a really good job highlighting some of those things.
Oh, they've done a
In recent-
very good job. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, when I went there when I was young, and when I used to travel in Virginia as a historian doing research, you'd visit Carter's Grove or something, and the docents, the guides, would talk about the servants. Servants? Yeah, they weren't servants, Cookie. They were slaves. And but the vocabulary, the words that were used, the terms that were mouthed by people like that, they didn't know any better, and that's the way they'd learned it, and that's the way we talked about those people. So there's been a vast transformation in that regard in the South. And look, look, I was thinking about this the other day. We talk about the fact that Robert Lee and others have been pulled down from their pedestals and so on, and that's a way in which there were enough people around with enough influence and so on, and they just said, we're just not going to take this anymore. And some of those statues were destroyed, but some were put in museums as evidence of the way the past earlier was rendered. But there's another aspect to this, and I think we should all keep it in mind, whatever our sectional loyalties and so on are. You can think of this as the North's finally winning the Civil War and the peace. Well, but look, the United States enforced the peace on Japan and on Germany after World War II. The North did not have the will to enforce the peace on the South. The South won the peace. Those who paid were African Americans. Now we're beginning to dismantle that Southern victory. And that is a change in the interpretation, and a vast change in the interpretation of how, as a collectivity known as the American nation, now permits its path to that part of its past to be rendered. That's a change. That's a change in interpretation. That's a revision of the way in which 50 years ago we looked at that subject. Now, whether you regard it favorably or unfavorably, the change is a fact. That doesn't mean 100 years from now, Bobby Lee's statue won't go back up on Monument Avenue. There's no way that we can guarantee that or prevent it. So come back in 100 years, we'll see.
Well, unless I have to say, everyone, that we started out talking a little bit about despair, but as we're talking now about how things do change, I like to think that maybe everything is a work in progress, and that we can be hopeful that we will still learn new things. You know, nothing is permanent.
That's correct, but we have to be prepared to learn things that we don't want to learn, and it makes and horrifies us about human life. I mean, that's part of it too. We come to different understandings of the things we wished human beings had never done to each other. So I don't think that history offers any solace. It offers hope, but it also offers despair. But what I was suggesting earlier is that historians can't despair as they try to figure out what did happen. Mm-hmm. Because if we truly despaired, we'd go and we'd be stockbrokers or something else. I mean, we'd lead a different kind of life, have different kind of work to do.
I think that's an excellent point to finish on. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Well, in that case, just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to speak with the village, and
It was
I
very
thoroughly
nice to be
enjoyed
with
it.
all of you. Good,
And
me too.
Thank you, Jim. We look forward to your plays. Are you still writing on that now?
Oh, Lorna, stop doing that. I'm trying to take the correspondence, the wonderful correspondence. It's a special favorite of mine between John and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson that went over more than 50 years. It's contained in about 378 letters between the three of them. I'm trying to get that up on stage. I'm not a playwright. I am not a dramatist. I don't want to have anything to do with the world of theater. I'm not of it, in it. So it probably will never happen, but it's one of the things that I'm having fun with at the moment.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, history does have good stories. So
Indeed.
thank you very, very much for having shared with us so much of your perspective on what history can mean to us today and beyond.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And thanks to all of you for sticking with me and for having me as your guest.